This is Alan Stanley and Dara Virks, who will be presenting on using Islandora Workbench to migrate to the new Islandora, and I'll let them do any further introductions of themselves with their presentation. So thank you so much, both of you, and go ahead.
Thanks,
well,
Amy.
I think our hope is to be pretty informal about this and have a bit of back and forth, and we're absolutely inviting inputs from everyone. I've worked with some of the people here. Nicole and I have been working on a migration for over a year. Dara and I did work together on a test project for Lyrasis with Amy a while ago. So a lot of this has been learning as we go. So we can talk about what's best practices for us does not necessarily mean it's going to be best for you. So we're kind of thinking of this in terms of an overview and what you can do about getting your ducks all lined up. So I work sometimes on my own, sometimes with Agile Humanities, and I have done a number of migrations. I had a big one that's just closing down now, took about a year, had about 1 million objects, some of which move very slowly, all kinds of weird server problems along the way. I've had big projects. We had an emergency one last year. Somebody was running out of funding, so we did their entire thing start to finish, including all planning, in just over 3 weeks. It actually went surprisingly well. So most of our results will be somewhere in between. So I'm going to turn it over to Dara now.
All right. I am the project manager lead at Born Digital. I've been here for a couple years. Before that, I worked in a Drupal agency. So I was very excited to be able to use more of my Drupal knowledge with new Islandora. So we've done several migrations here at Born Digital. I've overseen, I don't know how many, 5, 6 in the last while. So yeah, like Alan said, this is just based on sort of our learning as we've gone through these projects. And there's one thing I've seen is there's a lot of ways to do things. So that's one of the good things.
Yeah, sort of as we're starting out, there's a number of things, a number of steps that you have to go through, and this is the general order. The first one is defining the needs. This one is really important, and I advise you take a lot of time on this. Just make sure exactly what you want moved across, what you don't want moved across. One of the eye openers for me is I've been working with Islandora since the original version in 6, and then as it's progressed through, and we spent a lot of time worrying about revisions and making sure all the revisions are kept intact to the extent that some objects will have dozens of them. And so far, without exception, when we want to do the migrations, nobody's actually interested in the prior copies. They're happy to take it as is. So there are ways of doing deep copies, but it's not something that I've had trouble myself with. So we find out what we need, what we want to bring with us, what we want to leave behind. This is an excellent time to look at existing data and do some of the pruning and trimming that should have been done in the first place. You want to verify the accuracy of the source material. So again, this is a chance for good cleanup. It's just straight out drudgery. It's just looking through it. Super important to have somebody who knows that data really well, who can determine what's important, what's not. So you run through that to make sure that you're not bringing garbage over, or you have a good mitigation strategy for getting rid of the garbage once it's over, and it can be filtered through. So then once you have your data and you know what fields you want, then it's a question of building content type. And Rosie alluded to this a little bit earlier. We have the Islandora object, which is not bad. And it's going to cover about 90% of what you need. So this is when I like to take a little time to make sure that every field you're bringing in from the old site has a corresponding field to put into the new one. We all thought the transforming mods to a straight up Drupal field was going to be nightmarish. It actually turns out to be appallingly simple. It's mostly naming conventions, figuring out what you want, and identifying the type of where you go. Then what I like to do is harvest from Solar using the Workbench tools. I know Dara likes to work directly with the Solar GUI, which I also use a fair bit, but you don't always have access to it. Especially on a lockdown site, you may or may not even be able to get to that. So this is a way of filtering through, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things we can do with that. We've made a lot of changes to the harvester, and you can pretty much set that up with any Solar field you like now. You can put any filters in. It's got a lot of pre-built ones, so you can pull things out by content model. You can pull them out by collection. You can pull them out by combinations of the two, and you can put arbitrary fields in. And that's all set up to be pretty much straightforward. So what I will do is I will grab that data from Solar, and that comes in as a spreadsheet, and the columns of the headers are the mods fields that you've gathered it from, and they have to be changed to something more Drupal friendly. Sometimes they're combined. Sometimes you're bringing things in that need to be namespaced. For very small applications, you could probably do that by hand. I find it way simpler to bring it in with Python. I've got kind of a general template that I use, but it always needs to be altered. So generally what I'll do is using Python, I'll bring the spreadsheet in. There's some excellent Python tools for managing CSVs. So I'll open up the input, read that line by line, transform each line into the output, and then I have a second spreadsheet opened internally. So then just write that out, and then when you're done, you've got something that can be ingested. You're going to have to think a lot about the mapping, and this is not standard by any means. So we've done big migrations that as they look at the data, they realize there is nothing in mods that is not also available in the DC stream, which can be a little bit easier to work with. Sometimes you can use DC for almost everything you want. Some mod streams, sometimes you want a lot of mod streams. So this is where you figure it out. You transform your data and you push it into those sheets you want. And the next step is the one that is really important not to skimp on, is have a look at those spreadsheets when they come in, talk with your subject matter experts. So talk to the people who know the metadata. If you're doing your own migration, that's going to be you, but generally you want somebody with a bit of DevOps experience to run these for you. So this is when you need a lot of back and forth and verify that that every sheet you want is exactly what you want. We had one I worked on last summer. We had about 30,000 objects ingested before they realized that there was a couple of fields that had been missing. So mitigation is possible, it's all doable, but it's time consuming, and it makes way more sense to get this done right in the first place. And then you're going to ingest those spreadsheets. And I recommend starting with a very small one and verifying that 100% of your information is accurate. Now, my general approach to this is, because you can use Solr to filter however you like, I like to grab all the various container type objects. So we're going to build the structure by harvesting all your collections, all your compound objects, all your books. And then you build the new structure with that. And Workbench will push back to you what NID has been created from each PID. So you will have that mapping. And I find it really important to hang on to that. One of the things that we'll be getting to a little bit later is, as the sheet is set up, you can have the parent ID or you can have the member of. So member of is a Drupal thing, and parent ID is a Fedora thing. And it can use one or the other. But the thing is, if you're using parent ID in a spreadsheet, that ID has to be referenced in that spreadsheet once already before you use it. So this is normally not a problem, unless you've got a really big job that's going to be interfered, sometimes by your VPN going down, sometimes by your computer going to sleep. There's glitches. So you have to restart jobs all the time. And a small job, you can just rerun the whole thing. But in a big one, you can't do that. So generally speaking, even on a huge collection, once you've got your general structure, it's unlikely to be more than 1,000 objects at the most. And even that is pretty generous, depending on your setup. So once I've done that, then I have the homes for all the objects which are not collection style objects. So you sort of build up your skeleton, you build up your framework, and then you go and fill it in after that. This is a sample config. It's all isolated. It's object oriented. So you come up with your configuration. It's got a ton of defaults in there, which is easy to see it looking in the code. You just go into the utils. You can see what your mappings are, and every one of those can be overwritten. So this is just a sample one where you've got your Solr base URL and the Islandora base URL. So those are the two that you're grabbing, because you're going to be bringing some information from Solr, and then you go to the relsx and you pull some information out of that. And you've got an object directory, which is only necessary if you're pulling the files down, because you may bring the files down into a directory to be imported, or you may just be bringing down the URLs, which is how I tend to do it. You label your ID field, your ID start number, because that will be incremented automatically. Then you've got an optional content model and optional collection. You can put in a namespace, which can either be asterisk, so it includes it all, or if you've got a site, the one that the big migration that Nicole and I worked on, had a number of collections that were all beautifully namespaced. So it's a piece of cake. You go in, you grab your namespace, you bring back that entire collection. Then you can put in whatever solar filters you like. They can be absolutely anything. So I use this one a lot with the ancestor of Islandora root. As long as you have ancestor set up on your system, that will bring back your entire collection strategy.
This is an alternative method if you want to use the solar admin panel, which is what I generally do. So there's a couple different ways to figure out which fields you want. A lot of times we'll dump out all of the mods and DC fields, or we'll just do all the string or multi-string and date fields, save it in a CSV. We do like maybe not the entire collection, but a portion of the number of objects just to make sure you get everything, and look through and kind of see if you can consolidate any fields into one or get rid of some. And one thing about the DC fields, I had this happen with a client I'm working with now. We discovered that the DC fields didn't have all the data, because when mods fields were getting updated in their i7 site, it wasn't automatically updating the DC fields. So we determined we were missing some data in there, and we couldn't just use DC. So be careful to make sure that your DC fields have everything. And then once you figure out the fields you need, you create a really long query that goes into the filter FL field in the solar admin panel, which I have a screenshot on the next slide. There are also several other fields you need to include aside from mods or DC fields, which are listed here. You want the PID. There's a couple of Fedora data stream fields if you're pulling the media directly from the i7 site, which I'm going to talk about a little more later. There's some RELSX fields so that you can figure out the relationships of the objects to each other. And then the ancestors field is really important because it will show you the full relationship. So not just the direct parent, but all the way up the line. And that's really valuable. So if you don't have that field indexed already on your i7 site, it's good to add that and then re-index before you do any of this. So this is the solar admin panel, and I just have a little example here, and you can see in the Q query field, I'm searching for any object, and then in the FL field, I'm searching for any mods MS field, the PID, DC fields, and ancestors data. And I'm asking for output in a CSV format. You can do JSON, XML, there's a couple other options. And then in the start and rows fields there, sort of in the middle, you want to put in some kind of large number. So typically what is helpful is to first run this query as JSON with just the first like 100 or 200 rows. That'll output for you the total number of records, and then you can take a number somewhere in there, like maybe half that, because too many will just crash the admin. It just won't be able to output it all.
Yeah, I don't know what your experience is, Dara, but what I found is on big migrations, I don't really like to go much over 10,000 objects per sheet. The chance of failure just keeps increasing on you. The other quick caveat I'm going to throw in here is that with the way that books are ingested into D7, you get single-use solar fields. Sort of, this is a page of this object, and that's a separate thing. So on some instances, not all of them, in some instances, you can dump out all the mods fields and you'll just overwhelm your system. You can have like 40K of fields. It's insane. So that's the one that broke it for me.
So this, and again, this is just to figure out which fields you need. You're going to then narrow it down after you assess what's in those fields, because you can usually, there's a lot of duplicates. You can get rid of some, you can merge some. And so this, though, this is an example of not the entire thing, but a query listing all the required fields for one of the sites that I worked on. That was, they had a lot of fields, over, I think they had like 300 fields or something. And so when I broke it down to actually do the data dump out of solar, I broke it down by collection. So at the top, I have in the query, in the Q field, I have ancestors, MS, and then I would put the collection that I wanted all the children of. And then in the FL field, I have this big long thing, and we had to make some adjustments to even let that go through that long of a query. I think there was some kind of DevOpsy kind of thing we had to do because it was too long of a header. But that will then return to me all of the data for just the fields I want for a set of objects.
So these are some of the transformations that I do using Python. This is just a quick example I threw up there of what field comes back and what you transform it to. So, and this just happened to be one I was working on recently. So you can see like mods related, title info, title S. goes into the collection. Title info, title S goes into title. So this is the one that you really can't generalize. That's going to be one that varies not only from migration to migration, but sometimes from collection to collection, depending on who's been doing the import work on that. Mods was awesome. I really liked working with it, but it was huge and it was sprawling, and the same information could be listed a dozen different ways accurately. So it's really important to run through this. So this is one of the ways I do it. So I talked about this a little bit before, but you open the exported CSV, you create a new one, read it line by line, and then you just transform it as you go. So that's sometimes consolidating fields. That's name spacing, anything that references a particular taxonomy. Sometimes cleaning up stray characters. This is an excellent time to do cleanup. So just a good way of looking through that. Something that a nice little side effect that we've had is that if we can take things like names and put them into a taxonomy, there's then modules afterwards that will allow you to consolidate those taxonomies. So if you've got LM Montgomery and Lucy Maud Montgomery and L Maud Montgomery, you can stick them all into one term that you're happy with. So it's a nice way of cleaning up your data afterwards.
And I've had a lot of luck just using formulas in spreadsheets, like either in Google Sheets or Excel, to do a lot of the cleanup also. So if you're not as comfortable with Python, there's a lot of different things you can do just in your spreadsheet. There's also OpenRefine, which I don't have a ton of experience with, but it's a good time to use that as well.
Yeah, and that's an important point, because there's some extremely valuable tools that you can use within your spreadsheet, search and replace, and on a simple migration, you don't even have to do this. You can just replace all the headers manually as you go through. The disadvantage is that it's not replicable. And when you come back to do another object of the same collection that's been added 3 months later, you may or may not be able to remember how you did it exactly the last time. So it's an excellent point. We use it all the time, but it's something you do kind of on the fly, and it's difficult to document. It's difficult to get it exactly the same the next time. So this is what I was talking about earlier about filling in the collections, where you've got parent ID or field member of. Field member of is the node in the new system. Parent ID is the PID that comes in from the old system. It's not mandatory, but I really recommend storing the PID within that object somewhere. You can use it, not use it. You can clean the whole field out later, but it's really nice to be able to look at any object in the new system and know exactly how it relates back to the other one. So what I do is, once I've mapped the PID to a NID, I stick it into an SQLite database in my Python installation, so I can reference that at any time. Now, having said that, the SQLite is super easy to work with, but doesn't really offer any advantages over just making a great big dictionary and storing that. It uses up about the same amount of space, and using the database seems like it's going to be more efficient, but you can literally stick hundreds of thousands of lines into memory, and Python doesn't even notice. So that's just personal preference. If you don't want to use that interface, don't even bother. So it's exactly what I said. Take your legacy collections using the built-in script and make those changes, and you're ready to go.
And here's a little more information about what I mentioned earlier. You can pull your media files directly from i7 as long as they're publicly accessible, or you can make them publicly accessible for a small time period while Workbench grabs the URL. So you can use the file path to the OBJ or the JP2, and there are these two Fedora data stream fields that you can pull out of Solr, and they'll say whether the JP2 one will say JP2 in it, or the OBJ one will say OBJ in it. And that's how you know like whether the object has a file that you want to pull. And then you can construct the file path programmatically just using the pattern from i7. One thing, I did try to do this with some other data streams. I tried with mods and I tried with DC, and I don't know if it was this particular site I was working with, but Workbench couldn't tell what the file type was for it. There was no extension when Workbench was trying to grab it, even though if you downloaded it, it was an XML file. So I haven't had success yet doing this with other data streams. Maybe other people have.
Yeah, there's actually something built into Workbench where you can put in custom extensions, and we've run into that. I think it was text files are coming in as .asc files. So that's something you can stick right in the config. There's good sensible defaults built into Workbench, but there are, I don't know, we're probably up to 60 parameters in config that we can use one way or another. And that's one of them where you can specify custom mappings.
Yeah, I think I tried that with the mods and it didn't, for whatever reason, it was not working with this particular site. It may have just been, yeah, and there's also the new MIME type. You can declare MIME types, and it also, I think Mark added some default ones because I was also having a problem just recently where it didn't like TIFF files that were just TIF. So hopefully this will help that.
So as we said, if anybody is doing a migration and they're wondering where to get started, if you contact me directly, I'm on the Slack channel most of the time. I can show you how my Python stuff works. I don't have it generalized yet. I've got a skeleton that I use, but every single migration I do, I have to make some major changes to it. But I can certainly help anyone get started if they haven't worked with that before. Oh, this is one of the things about setting it up is Workbench was designed to be used from your computer. So you can, but it's actually quite a bit quicker under most circumstances to stick it onto either the host or the recipient computer that you're on, just because you're going, instead of having each asset handled, being downloaded to your computer, then downloaded back up over possibly questionable networks, you can go directly server to server, which is a little quicker. Just talking about where you're going to stick your Python, it's normally you want to put it onto the donor computer because that's going to have access to Solar, which may or may not be locked down. But I have run into a case recently that the i7 was hosted on a site old enough that it didn't really want to run new versions of Python without all kinds of ridiculous compiling. So I think can you remember, Dara? I think it's 3.7 Python is the minimum we use now.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, 3.738. So you need a computer that's going to run modern Python. But what I tend to do is I do the test collections from my desktop computer because when I run it locally, I run it through PyCharm, which is a free IDE that has awesome step-by-step debugging. So if something's not going exactly the way you want, throw a debugger in and you can see exactly where it's stalling, what information it doesn't have, and that it needs. Once you've got that, then run it on the server, and it's going to be quite a bit quicker there. Something that I like to do is I always create a separate config directory within Workbench, give the configs meaningful names, and that way you can go back and find out exactly what happened. You can replicate on really big jobs. For instance, you're going to want to filter line by line. So when you're doing your Solar queries, you're going to have start and end lines. I find it super helpful just to keep a record of everything that's been brought in and where it's come. Also, each job you run is going to have that NID to PID conversion. It's worth saving those. You never know when you're going to need them.
Yeah, Rosie, go ahead.
Thanks. Great presentation. I learned so much. I was wondering if because I'm just starting mine, I've actually got my sticky notes for my process and flowchart form up there. Did you think about doing like a bunch of update tasks? So kind of making some objects first and then populating them with either detailed metadata or stuff after the fact, so you didn't have to deal with ginormous spreadsheets with all your fields at the same time?
I usually go with the ginormous spreadsheet, and Nicole keeps me well challenged on this. But even there, we've got what, about 100 fields in the herbarium, Nicole?
Yeah, probably about that. There may be 100, but we're only using maybe 30. But we have to keep the others available in case one partner decides to use one we didn't think of.
But no, I haven't done that. It's always seemed easier to me just to get it in one pass. Although we've just done a migration that has about 100,000 objects that are missing a field that nobody thought was important until the job was done, and now we're going to have to go back. So I'll certainly let you know how that goes.
As long as you have your PID to NID mapping. That's really cool to stick it in SQLite. I might try that. Thanks.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you haven't done that, it's pretty simple to throw a view together. As long as you've stored your PID, and I always store the PID because you never know. But just take a view that will grab every object and have its view, or have the grab that field from it is not particularly difficult, and you can export that as a CSV. The nice thing about doing it with the SQLite is they have the equivalent of an upsert command. So every new batch you do, if you've overwritten an old one because you've done a re-ingest, it keeps everything completely up to date, as long as you make sure that ingesting into that database is part of your workflow.
Yeah, I'm at the stage where I'm exploring your build a content type stage. Do you always do that through the Drupal interface, or are you building the new fields programmatically? I guess, do you have some pro tips for the build content type stage?
I have done it programmatically, but honestly, it's easier just to go in when you see a field, just create the content type on the fly. It's simple to do. You can make a decision then about what do you want it to be, an entity reference field. If so, what vocabularies do you want it to reference, what your data type is. It's easier to do that way. So typically what I'll do is I'll go through and I'll identify everything I can and do those. And then the first time you run it, Workbench very helpfully points out all the ones you forgot. And then you go and hit those and try again.
Thank you very much.
I have just done it manually because you have to be sure to indicate what kind of field you need, because you can change some things, but you can't change after the fact whether it's an unlimited or limited field. So if you set something as limited to only one value and then you realize later you can have multi-values, it's a whole, like you have to create another field and you can't just change it later. So that's one really important thing to make sure you know ahead of time.
However, there actually is a way of doing that, but it's non-trivial. It involves shenanigans, and you have to hold your breath while you're doing it. And it's worked for me so far, but so much better to get it right the first time.
It's not a way that you can do from the Drupal interface anyway, I don't believe.
Oh God, no. There is another way you can do it, and that's to create a new field, which is set up the way you want it, and then use VBOs to transfer everything from field A to field B, and then delete field A, but do it right the first time. You'll be so much happier.
Annie, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, actually, I had a question with these larger migrations that you guys have been doing. How often are you getting derivatives not working or imports not working? Like, how often is the fail rate with those?
It's there. I'm glad you brought that up, because a huge caveat is if you're using a Docker instance out of the box, the JWT has a 2-hour expiry date on it. And the JWT should actually be more like 3 months if you're doing a big ingestion. Derivatives fail from time to time, although not all that often. But again, that can be fired off with a batch job without a great deal of difficulty later. So you can, if the derivatives weren't created the first time, it's not catastrophic. And if an object does not get pulled in, then you will see errors, and you should have a mitigation strategy for that. So it was the first one we did, the project that Amy and I worked on, and Dara. There was a lot of failures. So I had to have scripts that would re-ingest those. So much of it depends on your servers. Some of them hiccup more often than others do. And you're going to determine your batch size and how big a pause to put in. And I've written some experimental code that's not been rolled out yet for a problem that we had only on one server. And that's that I would have to, for reasons we weren't able to figure out, it would, the first time you ran it through, it would not recognize the data type. The second time it would. So I just had to put a loop in. So if it failed the first time, try it again. If it failed second time, try it again. If it failed the third time, then you've got other problems. So yeah, definitely something to keep an eye of. Start with small batches and find out where that problem lies. The other thing, and this is something that comes up on the board all the time, is your watchdog logs are super important. So if your Workbench job has failed and you have no idea why, just go into the logs on the computer that's receiving the information, and you will get the info you need most times. So if you've got a 422, if you've got a 500, it gives you a little bit more depth on that.
Thank you, Alan.
Alan, at some point, speaking of the 422, because that was the problem I had yesterday, can you show me where on our server at some point off this, where to find that log? Because the log I looked at Workbench didn't explain it.
Yeah, that's a good example. It was one of a mismatched data type. So you get the 422, and 422 is the error that says, I don't know what you're asking me to do. So that was in the watchdog log, which you can see under config reports, recent, I can't even remember the name of it, and I use it every day. It's the error log. If something's failed, check immediately, and you're going to see a PHP error, and it'll tell you exactly what went wrong. So that went in, I looked at it, said, this is the field. I don't know how to process this. And it was a field that needed a Boolean and nothing else would do.
I should also say the fix you did for our issue where it wasn't creating the derivative on the first try because of I believe it was because of the file format, right? Because we were using JP2s for the herbaria. That's worked pretty seamlessly since you added that to give it a second tip for it to try a second time. Always does it on the second try.
And I just have to have a look at that. For some reason that's broken rollbacks, and I don't know why, so I'm gonna have to go in and have a look at that. But it's just yet another config parameter to have it try a couple of times. Because we do have the adaptive pause, and you can stick a pause in anywhere just to slow things down. But sometimes you can only find that by trial and error. And sometimes it's quicker to just let it go flat out. If it makes a mistake, make it do it again. But the one thing that we're telling all our new clients now, when they're asking how much horsepower to throw at their server, we all say more. Give it everything you can possibly afford. The quicker the server, the more memory, the happier you're going to be. What you will find with Workbench is once you get up over, say, 200,000 objects, there's an SQL, and I've looked at optimizing it, and I've not been able to make much progress on it. Everything's indexed, but it's about a 25 second SQL, which means if you're ingesting 10,000 objects, you've got a lot of time soaked up in this. I'm not sure how, as I say, the biggest migration we've done is involved, I think it was just shy of 400,000 objects. And when you go beyond that, things slow down a fair bit. So in this one server, I used to be able to do 10,000 objects. I would start the batch job every day at about noon. And when I got up in the morning, it was done. By the end of it, it was taking 3 days to do 10,000 objects. So those of you who are good at math will realize that large spreadsheets are going to take more and more time.
It's really a good idea to run screen when you're doing the ingest so that when your computer goes to sleep, it doesn't kill the whole thing if you're running it on a server.
Yeah, oh yeah, the big jobs I always run from a server, but they are kicked off locally. And sort of a handy tip, if you've got your sheet set up right so it is not requiring a prior ingest. So in other words, if everything is member of instead of parent ID, Workbench will tell you the last row that was successfully ingested. And in fact, your Drupal install would just go into content, see the last object that was brought over successfully, delete those objects from your spreadsheet and fire it up again, and it'll finish the job for you. When we had the power outages last fall with Fiona, even when it came back, power was a little bit iffy. So every time it stopped out, you'd have to restart the job.
Are there any other questions or any comments from folks who have also done migrations using Workbench, maybe from a repository manager standpoint, or maybe from some other kind of, or not, or also from a dev standpoint? Is there anything else that folks would want to share in terms of this particular route to migration?
Well, I know I keep learning things that I do differently. Nicole, what would you do differently as repository manager?
Well, our biggest kind of conundrum right now is what to do with those scrapbooks that didn't migrate because they were so complicated. They were compound objects that were just very intermingled with like the whole page, the entire scrapbook of pages, but then we had some highlights of inclusives within it. And I think I would have thought more about those types of things, those types of collections, those compound collections, and how they were in a spreadsheet, and maybe focus on them a little more at the migration stage. Whereas now we're doing it kind of fresh as a new ingest, trying to rebuild from old data. But there's also a positive. It really wasn't done the way anyone wanted it to be done the first time.
Yeah.
So now we can look at it with fresh eyes and try to think of a better way to do it. Most of our collections were pretty straightforward, I think, but that was a really weird one.
And actually, Nicole raises a good point there. Sometimes on small, weird collections, makes way more sense just to do them one by each than it does to try and come up with some kind of overarching strategy in case you ever run into this particular weirdness again. So if it's a small collection, sometimes easier to do it by hand.
But overall, I think the migration went really well. We did have some issues with things that were supposed to be under copyright instead of private, but we weren't even aware of it at the start of the project or during migration. This came up afterwards. So we did have to go one by one. It was one of the music collections, song sheets. And so Sharon had to go one by one after the migration. And thankfully, because we had that ID number, that PID, we could go back to the old system and try to figure out what was going on there too, because that was another project where we didn't have a lot of history on why it was done the way it was, or which things were supposed to be restricted and which weren't. So yeah, just if you have things that are under restriction, like track that. So when it moves over, you can QC to make sure it's the same.
Rosie, your hand was up.
Thanks. I haven't been using Workbench for the last few months, and I'll be doing it soon. But when you are trying to get your PID to node ID mapping, how do you do that? Do you still have to copy and paste the text output that says node 620 or node has been created for ID Island Lives 123 at, localhost 8080 / and then the node ID? Like, you don't have to parse that now.
No, there's it produces a log with all that in it.
Oh, okay, great. Is that the Workbench log?
No, I think you specify that directly. I'll have to look that up. I haven't used it for a while. The thing you have to look at is that it overwrites. And it can be specified in the config file. And I think it's just called output file as opposed to log. But change the name with every config, or else make sure you harvest it. Because once it's going to say once it's gone, but that's not entirely true, because you can build a view super easily to output all that from what's been ingested.
Typically what I do is in my YAML file, I'll call it, because you can specify the name of the output file in your config, and I just take the name of my CSV and I put that -output.csv, and then you make sure you have a different one for every ingest that you do, and then you can take all those node IDs. But one thing I found is sometimes if something didn't ingest fully, or I had to, for whatever reason, redo it, I just ended up with some objects that didn't have the right node ID anymore because they had been recreated later or something happened. So you just have to be careful of that.
And again, harvest them live and they'll be 100% accurate. The difficulty is if you've had problems in your ingest, it's possible you've got two nodes associated with the same PID because you've imported the same object twice at different times. And then you have to make a determination of which is the one you want to keep if they're not identical.
You mentioned earlier about restrictions as far as access on certain media objects prior to migration. And just as what happened to us with one particular, so our oral histories, we had a small handful, it wasn't a big deal, but just so other folks may have larger collections that this happens, they were restricted, they were secured. So because the folks that performed the oral histories, so they didn't want anyone listening to it for like 50 years or whatever. So they didn't move over. So we actually had to go back to our preservation storage and manually add them back with our new permissions and access system that we had in place in the new one. So
that's one of the restrictions we've had. And in fact, even when you're grabbing those objects, you can't put authorizations in you can't log in programmatically as an authorized user. So it's either open or not. So we have done, I don't think we did this on yours, but something that we have done is taken the old site offline for about a week, restricted it by IP, opened everything up, pull all the information out, and then set it back to the way it was.
Yeah, our use case was such a small number. We figured we'd go back and fix them later.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point. Is sometimes you don't need to overcomplicate it. Sometimes just if you're looking at a dozen objects, so much faster just to do the drudgery.
Yeah, we uploaded access restricted items to our AWS server and IP restricted them there to pull them down from there into the new site so that we weren't pulling them across the open web. Also kind of a boutique experience, but the number wasn't so great that it was, ridiculous to do. The only other thing I would say from sort of the repository manager side is it's really important to have a good idea of what things should look like when they come over and to be kind of checking and doing that QC regularly so that you can figure out if something's wrong before you're, early. When there's only a couple of things wrong, as opposed to when there's 10,000 things wrong. I think that's a really important component of the migration, and strongly encourage there to be a plan that you as the repository manager and your team have worked out with anyone who's managing your repository as a vendor, so that you sort of have been talking about what your expectations are and how that might work, because it's so much easier if you catch things early and can start figuring out that rather than doing this huge remediation project later. So strongly encourage that as part of the migration strategy, is to be thinking through how you're going to be making sure that things look like what you want them to look like as you go, And I think to some extent we did that well, and to some extent there's things I was like, oh, I could have done that a little differently and we might have caught things sooner. So
Well, absolutely. And if you've done the same thing wrong to everything, it's an easy fix with a VBO. But if you've got missing data, that's not a simple fix. It's doable, but it's not a simple fix.
I really want to thank Alan and Dara for coming and talking to us about this and giving people a really thorough overview of what the Workbench migration pathway looks like. There's the migrations channel on Slack. There's also the Islandora Workbench channel on Slack, which are great places to ask more questions about this. If there's other information about migrating using Workbench that folks on this call who are looking to migrate, possibly using Workbench, are like, this is what I need to know, please do reach out to the ICC and let us know what would be more helpful for you going forward. Once you've had a chance to look at some of the documentation and figure out, is there enough there? Is there something else that would be more helpful? What more could be helpful? Because we'd appreciate that feedback too. Yeah, so again, thank you so much, Alan and Dara. Thank you everyone who's come and asked questions and given answers and helped kind of think through what this might look like and sort of planning for your own migrations. Yeah, and join us again in May. We're planning to have a discussion overview of some of those Drupal pathways in May. So hopefully that kind of covers the main ways that this can happen, and let us know if there's other feedback. And I think that really finishes up our meeting.